Hey everyone, it's Diana from Adventures with Art, and today we are talking about the 5 basic skills of drawing. These 5 things are so fundamental to every drawing that you either see in the world or complete yourself. So it's really important to understand them and how they all work together to create amazing drawings. But before we get started, I want to make sure you hit that subscribe button. Keep coming back to Adventures with Art for more art tips. We also talk about how to make money with your art, which is never a bad thing. So hit that subscribe button and be sure to follow along. Another thing I want to mention is that I have a free trial for Skillshare down in the show notes. Skillshare is an amazing platform. I'm a proud member of their paid service, but luckily you do not have to pay anything. Through that link, you can get a free trial, which gives you free unlimited access to all of their professional art classes, which are really incredible and have personally helped me take my skills to the next level. It is an affiliate link, so know that you would be supporting this channel at no additional cost to you if you use it. I would greatly appreciate it. All right, so the 5 basic skills of drawing. The first one, edges, or lack of edges. If you think about every single thing you see in the world, it is made up of lines, and those lines come together to form edges. And that's how we can tell the difference between a square and a triangle and a tree and a dog and a computer and a person, right? So we are all formed out of distinct lines that come together to create edges and define the shapes that we know in the world, right? So this is not only something about drawing, but just something about how we differentiate everything in our everyday life and in the world. And if you're going to be drawing, and if you're going to represent, a square instead of a triangle, you better use 4 lines and 4 edges for that square and 3 lines and 3 edges for that triangle, or else you're going to end up with a problem where no one knows that you've just drawn a square or a triangle, right? So it's really important to understand how lines actually come together to create the shapes that we understand, right? So, we all think about kindergarten and how we learn the basic shapes of a square, a triangle, a circle. And then as we progress, we then come to understand like a hand, like how you draw a hand. When you think about it, a hand is just a series of lines that come together to form edges. Some of them are round at the fingers. Some of them are, create like more jagged edges right here in the creases of the hands or in the fingers, right? How do lines come together to form the shapes that we know? And how do you then represent them in your art, right? So like a circle doesn't have any edges. But that's a very important thing. The lack of edges is what defines it, right? So it's really important to look at objects around you and to say, where are the edges? What are the lines? Like, why is that a tree and not a computer, right? Like, obviously there's biology going on there, but how do we see it as a tree? Like, why, how do trees have similarities in the edges they create versus like, how do computers have similarities in the edges that they create? If you can figure out those similarities between common objects, it's much easier to sit down and then draw a tree from memory and draw a computer from memory, or a dog or a person or all these different things, right? Remembering and understanding the various edges and the lines that come together to form those edges, such a fundamental point of drawing, and translating what like you're actually trying to translate through your drawing. Otherwise, if you can't do that, people have no idea what you've just drawn. So that's why it's extremely important. The next one is space. So this is the space that your object takes up and the space that it doesn't take up, right? So for example, let's think about a bagel. We all know bagels are bagels because they have that classic hole in the middle, or a donut, right? They are known for the space that they do not take up. And similar to edges, this is really important. Wherever you don't have lines, wherever you don't have, stuff, you have empty space, which is what we call negative space. As you can see, this negative space is just as important as the actual space that the bagel takes up. If we didn't have this empty space, we wouldn't have this classic hole in the middle and we wouldn't know it's a bagel. So as you'll see, all of these 5 basic skills kind of come together. And the last one, as you'll see, the skill is how it all comes together, right? So think of each of these skills as building upon each other, we needed those edges in order to have the space. Okay, so these edges that we have here in this bagel then come together to form a circle, which then creates the space in the middle and the space along the outside. And we can say, hey, that's a bagel. Okay, so knowing how empty space works in your drawings is a really important thing to then having objects that look like the objects you're trying to represent. The next one is light and shadow. We live in a very variable type of world when it comes to lights coming from all different directions. You know, we have the sun, we have lights overhead, we have lights from our screens, we have then shadows being caused by trees, by objects, by other people, right? And it all creates this really dynamic, variable world that we interact with, right? So what's really important is to understand how lights and shadows function on your objects, and what impacts they are having. Like, how does it change how the object looks? You know, what are the shadows on one object versus an object next to it, and how do you put those in the same piece of art and have them look like they actually are inhabiting the same world, right? So if you are trying to draw a still life, for example, and you have an apple sitting next to an orange, but like the apple looks like it has a completely different light source than the orange, they're not going to look like they are even in the same universe, right? Like, you need to have all of your lights and shadows interacting with each other when you're drawing a scene, so that it all looks like one cohesive thing. So that is super important. It's also really a great way to study color, because color is impacted by light. You know, when you have less bright light, you're going to have darker, more saturated colors, and that slowly fades into less saturated colors as the light becomes brighter. Understanding how to make that grade and how to fade your darks into lights, so that you have effective shadows, is a really important thing to be able to learn to do, and to understand. So where is your light coming from? How does that create then this gradient of colors? And what do those colors look like? How do you create colors that seem to be coherent across the spectrum? That's such a fundamental thing to understand with drawing, even if you're drawing just in black and white. How do you make those darks into lights in a coherent way that makes sense and actually resembles real life? That's really important. All right, so our fourth skill is about relationships. And this kind of goes back to what we were just talking about, how if you have an apple and an orange in the same scene, how the environmental impacts of like light and shadows are going to affect them as though they are in the same scene. It doesn't make sense if one has something completely different going on than the other. And that's a really important aspect of having realistic drawings. Even if you're doing cartoons, you need to get this right, or else the cartoons won't seem like they function in the normal universe, right? So this can work in the form of just even lines. So if these four lines are splayed out like this, it doesn't look like a square. These lines have to have a relationship with each other. They have to be exactly, parallel to each other in order to have that square. So how do those lines have a relationship with each other in order to create the shapes that you are trying to draw and you are trying to communicate? You cannot think about them as isolated lines, or else you won't end up with a square. You'll end up with lines all over the place, and that's not going to do you any good. So fundamentally, how does each line have a relationship with the next line so that it creates the object you're trying to create? This also has to do with objects overall. So for example, if I'm drawing a mouse next to a building, like, this mouse better be smaller than the building, or else we're in some kind of sci-fi image, which is totally fine if that's what you're going for. But if you're going for a realistic image, you have to figure out what are the proportions here and how do these things work together, and how do they function in real life. So a lot of this has to do with figuring out perspective and proportions, and just overall atmosphere of the drawing you're trying to create. You need to make sure you understand how all of those pieces work together to create your drawing. Okay, so we've come to the last one, and the last one is really the whole. And as you noticed, all the four skills we talked about really just build up into the whole. You know, how do your edges come together? How do your lights and shadows work together? You know, how do you have proportions that are correct? How does, you know, this one object relate to the next one? How does the spacing work? All of that comes together into the whole. And so really, you need to integrate all of these skills in order for a drawing to work effectively. And so that fifth skill, it seems a little silly, but it is the fifth skill, is to integrate them and to bring them all together as a whole for one cohesive drawing. All right, so those are the 5 skills of drawing. Again, if you want to work on those skills, head over to Skillshare. They have so many great classes about the fundamentals of drawing, which can be really helpful in taking your skills to the next level. I hope that was helpful. Please keep coming back to Adventures with Art. I will see you next time.